The CPI figures for the September quarter have been released today by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The Consumer Price Index rose 1% for the quarter compared to 0.5% for the June quarter. Queensland was slightly above the average with a CPI rise of 1.3% for the same period. Interestingly, falls were recorded for fruit and vegetables, pharmaceuticals, financial services and audio, visual and computing equipment. The big increases, however, have come from groups that are controlled by various levels of government. Electricity prices have risen 11.4% nationally and water and sewage by 14.1% in the last quarter. Chris Leithner is Company Director and Investor. Good afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Should anyone be surprised that when it comes to inflation, it's actually, in this case, government pushing the inflation rate up?
Oh, of course not, because government is the sole author of inflation. What is inflation? It's an increase in the money supply. There's more money chasing the same amount of goods. In other words, the purchasing power of a dollar decreases, or in other words, prices rise. Now, why do they tend to rise more in more heavily regulated areas? Local government, you mentioned water, sewerage, etc. Well, left to their own devices, a free man, a free woman, they're going to try to serve the consumer as best they can. They're chasing after profits. The more regulations they are, the more the business has to serve not consumers, but bureaucrats, whether it's in Canberra or at the top of George Street. So what you've described is a regular phenomenon. That's to say it's government which creates inflation. Some suffer from it more, others benefit from it, the insiders and so on. But the net result, purchasing power decreases, prices rise. As a result of government actions, consumers suffer.
So with that, why can governments get away with these huge price rises that others may not be able to? Is it purely because they control that market?
It's control of the market, and it's not putting two and two together. On the one side, politicians rail about monopolies. Monopolies are evil, etc., which is quite right. But in the same breath, they talk about the Reserve Bank of Australia, which has a monopoly over the definition of money, the creation of money, the supply of money. If the ACCC, well and truly, were a monopoly-busting organisation, one of the first things you'd shut down would be the central bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia. So the answer to your question is Australians, it seems to me, are quite schizophrenic about this. On the one hand, we'll rail about what are alleged monopolists in the private sector, but scot-free, we let off monopolists in the public sector.
Is there evidence that privatisation of these services would lead to better services and cheaper prices? We're having this argument about asset sales at the moment.
Well, if it's fair income privatisation, if it leaves human beings, men and women, to serve consumers as they see fit without having first to satisfy bureaucrats, then it seems to me if people are left alone, they're going to chase a dollar where they see it. When government steps in, when you have to serve a bureaucrat first, when coercion is entered into the equation, then in order to satisfy the law, of course, then people are going to have to satisfy the bureaucrats. They in effect have one hand tied behind their back, so they can't satisfy the consumer nearly as well. In the world of Bill Gates, for example, the price of computing relentlessly falls and falls and falls, and people don't regard that as a problem. Quite the contrary. People applaud falling prices. In other aspects, people, presumably half of the country would have a heart attack if the price of real estate fell. But let's think about that. For a lot of young people, the victims of inflation, of rising prices, a fall in the price of residential real estate is a good thing because their dollar will go further. But those who are heavily indebted, who have benefited from the government's inflation, that's an horrifically bad thing for them. Same with the so-called interest rate rises from the central bank. It's treated as if across the board it were a bad thing. But for people who are trying to live off their savings, who are trying to save money, an increase of interest rates, of deposit rates from banks, that's a very good thing. So not only do governments create inflation, they're the sole cause of inflation, they create winners and losers.
Chris, we've had the opposition saying today federally that it's the economic stimulus that has led to inflation. Then we had Wayne Swan saying no, it's because state governments have failed to control electricity prices. How do we decide between those two arguments as to who's right?
Let's think first in terms of a free man and a free woman trying to satisfy a consumer. That's point one. Point two, governments don't stimulate. They don't create jobs. They might reallocate jobs from here over there and thereby create shortages in one area, gluts in the other. A job that allegedly is created today is a job that's not going to be created tomorrow or the next day and so on. So it seems to me we have two wings of a single bird of prey. Some people call the one wing Liberal National. Other people call them Labour. The point is they have a vested interest in inflation. Why? Because by inflating, the entire country can live beyond its means. Not just consumers who get indebted over their heads, but governments as well, particularly the US government now, which is relying almost completely upon inflation in order to pay its bills, in order somehow, allegedly, to engineer an inflation. So quite frankly, I may well be overly cynical upon this, but I can't see how anyone can accord any credibility to anything that any politician of any stripe says on this sort of issue.
So, with the rises that we've seen for this quarter, electricity prices nationally 11.4%, water and sewerage 14.1%. Aren't rises of this magnitude unsustainable in the long term?
Well, in the sense that there comes a point where people are going to decline to pay those sorts of prices. That's to say they'll presumably reduce their consumption of electricity, reduce consumption of water and so on. But that's not due to a natural phenomenon in terms of the true underlying demand and supply of water, sewage, etc. That's, it seems to me, primarily due to artificially rising prices due to bad policy. In a natural economy, in the Bill Gates world, again, the natural thing is that prices fall, that the dollar stretches further over time, people's income buys more over time. The answer to your question is no. It seems to me these things can't continue forever, but it'll be because prices are this sort of inflation-based rise in prices. How do people suffer? Among the ways they suffer, they consume less electricity than they otherwise could or would, less water than they otherwise could or would.
Some might see that as a good thing, that we're not using our natural resources as much.
Well, if it's due to what individuals decide, look, I'll economise, and there's everything to be said for fed income economisation, but if it's basically because of stuff-ups amongst bureaucrats, and I can't see that that's due to economy drives, that's due to the mistakes of others, not the good-heartedness of consumers out there.
When the government cries foul over petrol prices, electricity prices, distancing themselves, we didn't set the electricity price, we've got an independent board that does that. Is there a facet of secretly rubbing their hands with glee? The higher the price, the more GST they receive, for example.
Well, one of the benefits of government inflation is that it pushes people into higher income tax brackets and therefore increases revenue coming into the government's coffers. So the answer to your question is yes. But consider for a moment, on the one hand, there will be people, for example, at the Reserve Bank who would run a mile a minute from the notion that they should control petrol prices, the price of fuel at the pump. But virtually in the same breath, they'll say, but we insist upon, as a monopolist, to fix and control the price of a particular rate of interest. So again, we're talking about governments talking in both ends of the mouth simultaneously, and of course the language is going to be incoherent as a result of that. But the critical point, yes, is that governments benefit from inflation. It enables them basically to spend beyond their means, in the same way that certain people who borrow too much at all the wrong times and so on, they too temporarily can live beyond their means. The trouble, though, we're finding it now in America and in England, that can't go on forever. Eventually a reckoning comes, and it seems to me that day is probably, if it hasn't arrived already in America, it's very, very close. And similarly in the UK, when suddenly the talk is of dramatic cutbacks, this has to be eliminated, and so on, not in terms of a rational decision to say, gee, what's the most appropriate use of a tax dollar, but kind of a panicked, let's simply slash across the board.
Yep. Is this the second wave people are talking about, that because the economic stimulus across the world in these nations has kept these institutions propped up, that now there's no more money to throw at it, we're going to see maybe what really should have happened in the first place?
Basically, yes, that human beings, whether the Australians and others, decry binge drinking, but they applaud binge economics. And the economics and politics of stimulus is basically taking a drunk who's borrowed too much, who's lived beyond his or her means, and has temporarily propped him up, basically has pushed a bit more debt down his throat, or a bit more alcohol down the alcoholic's throat. That might temporarily rouse him out of the gutter, but again, it's eventually going to kill him. And so the answer to your question, it seems to me, is this is a temporary effect. The politics of stimulus will get a couple of governments across the line. In the short term, they can chant about the various benefits that are arising, that they're generating. But when the bills come due, people will see, gee, prices are rising, my tax bill is rising, the government debt is going through the roof. The costs of all of these packages in the long term are much greater than the so-called benefits in the short term. So it seems to me there's bills to be paid. The fact that politicians are masters at maximising the alleged benefits in the short term and distracting our attention from the cost in the long term. Once again, inflation benefits them, but it harms virtually everybody else.
Chris Leithner, good talking with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Great pleasure.
Chris Leithner, Company Director and Investor, 612 ABC Brisbane.